Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Monatea. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at GW. We are really delighted today to have Dr. Kareem Rabie with us to talk about his recent book, Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited, Capital and State Building in the West Bank. Dr. Rabie is assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and his research focuses on privatization, urban development, and state building projects in the West Bank. Before joining the faculty at UIC, he was assistant professor at the American University here in DC and a Harper Schmidt Fellow at the University of Chicago. He's embarking on a new research project on circulation and the new human and economic geographies of Palestine-China trade. He'll be in conversation with our very own Dr. Nathan Brown, who's professor of political science and international affairs here at GW and was the institute director before I was. Dr. Brown teaches courses on Middle East politics, comparative politics, and international relations. And he has previously served as an advisor for the committee drafting the Palestinian Constitution, to USAID, to the UN Development Program, and many NGOs, as well as his work at Carnegie. He's author of many books, but I will just mention his most recent one, which is Lumbering State, Restless Society, Egypt in the Modern Era, which he co-edited with Shima Hatib and Amr Adli. And that was just released in October, but we will be doing an event in February. So looking forward to being in conversation with you, Nathan, at that time. Just before I pass the floor over to Nathan to start the conversation, I want to say that you can put questions in the chat at any time, and Shana Marshall, the Associate Director of the Institute, will be moderating the conversation moderating the questions once the conversation is over. And I want to thank Christian Clinton, our operations manager, for all his hard work to make these events possible, and Elad Raymond for his help with publicity. So without further ado, Nathan, I'll let you take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mona. Thanks, Christian and Shana for working on this. And let me start with a one-word comment for Kareem. But it'll lead to a question. The one-word comment is just congratulations. I mean, it's when you have a book come out, it feels really, really good. But here's the question. How come you wrote this book? And it's connected to the congratulations because there's an enormous amount of research that went in here. You've been working on this for over a decade. And it's kind of centered around Rawabi, a place, I've driven by a million times, well, not a million times, but maybe a dozen or so, and never really sort of thought, and I saw it kind of emerging, never really, I kind of ignored it. And you spent an awful lot of time kind of using this as sort of a prism for understanding broader development in Palestinian society and economy and politics, and so on. And again, there's just an enormous amount of information that you seem to have collected. My sense is you could probably have written a 10-volume set with the amount of data you collected. So tell us a little bit, if you can, about why you selected this. And Rabie, I'm the one who's using the word prism, but how do you sort out a story about this through all the information you collected?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, thank you to Lynette, to you, Professor Brown, to Christian, to Shana. It's nice to meet you, Nathan. Okay, the question is, how come I wrote this book? Which is kind of a brutal question. I guess the angle that you're asking me is sort of why Rawabi and how I ended up there. And I think that I guess the answer to the question is sort of partially personal and partially methodological, which is that I started going to Palestine for research in 2007. And I, was influenced by a lot of work that, about the wall, about fragmentation. There's a lot of kind of like technophilic work in anthropology and geography. And also there's a lot of work on, what I've sort of talked about is the binary between resistance and domination. There's a heavy emphasis, especially in anthropology, I think, on like micropolitics, on finding sort of politics in everyday practices. And when I went, I started to, wonder about all the practices that weren't resistive in obvious ways, And I had this plan that I wanted to study truck-to-truck traffic, and I wanted to use that as a way to sort of pry open, truck-to-truck trade, and to sort of pry into the various ways that the plans and development plans and sort of state scale plans intersect with sort of market formation, or like the borders of the market. And it sort of turned out that those plans kind of went in and out of favor at various times, and nothing really ended up happening with them in a big way, or in the way that the sort of the plans were proposing. And I was struggling for, I was looking for field sites that helped me to understand kind of like what was happening at Palestine at different geographical scales, especially with regards to investment and, sort of what capitalism has to do in Palestine. And then when I was there for my longest stretch of field work, the Rawabi project just sort of pierced the public imaginary. It happened. You started to see the billboards for it. You started to see the sort of ads for it in the upscale supermarkets on the TV screens. And then at some point shortly thereafter, they put up signs all along the Birzeit roads, signs from Ramallah to the site itself, well before there was any real site to speak of or go visit. It was before groundbreaking. And it just struck me as a place that maybe I could answer some of these questions. So I started talking to real estate developers. I went to the office and I started establishing contacts with them. And I think that it, readers will be the judge of how much I succeeded. But I think that I found a place that helped me to understand a lot of these phenomenon at multiple scales. And that's why Rawabi. I guess also, I'm not like strictly interested. I don't really know how to put it. I'm not strictly interested in Rawabi. I don't think of this as a book about Rawabi, although it's really all over it. So that's kind of a bogus thing for me to say, but it's how I feel. And so I think that, I really did want to use it as a prism, or a site to see all these phenomenon as they come in and out, and get tied up in that place. That was my goal with the Rawabi thing. Yeah. But yeah, how come I wrote the book is, well, why do we do anything really? So.
Well, thank you. The only reader I know, only one of your readers I know so far is me, and I certainly enjoyed it, so I'm glad you wrote it. But there was another part to my question is kind of not just why, but kind of how did you write it? And let me put this a little bit specifically, because you talked about, collecting all these plans and they kind of go in and out. There's a focus on planning. There's a focus on law. You do something interesting in law. Anytime I've done work on Palestinian law, which I have kind of like off and on episodically, this is a place that, and these are institutions that generate enormous amounts of like paper and laws, regulations, plans, and reports, and so on. And so you've collected all these, but you do something kind of interesting with them, right? So you don't dismiss them, but you don't take them literally. So can you tell us a little bit? And I guess this is partly methodological questions. What do you do? I mean, one big theme in the book is about. I mean, this would, again, my phrasing, not yours. Law isn't what it appears to be, but it matters. Or legal texts aren't what they appear to be. Planning documents aren't what they appear to be, but they do matter. They're not irrelevant. So can you tell us a little bit about how it is that you use just the written documents that you collected?
Sure. I mean, I was thinking about it this morning when I was walking the dog. I was thinking about, sort of how, you engage with these kinds of material and these kinds of processes, and are really methodical about it, and really sort of understand the law and the way these things happen in ways that I'm quite openly do not. But I think that what I was coming to, as an anthropologist and a geographer, was trying to understand practices around these things, and sort of like what they index, what they can tell us, but also how they orient behavior. So one of the things that I said over and over again was, or tried to understand throughout, is a better way of putting it, is how these reports and documents and practices create precedents, and sort of how they orient behavior. And so, like, among the sort of the people who are making them, among the state actors, among the sort of legal actors, let's say. And it seemed to me that, as these documents move around, they kind of accrue legitimacy. So the truck to truck thing was maybe one of the first instances where I started to see it happening, which is that there were countless reports that were saying this is the way to sort of build an economy, this is the thing that's going to happen. And of course, the projects really never happened. And so what I started to see, or to believe, I guess, is how sort of funding or ideology or practices are oriented around this sort of like growing body of literature and knowledge production in these kinds of reports. So one of the sections perhaps that you have in mind is where I talk about these studies where private sector and sort of pro privatization NGOs, along with people in the PA, did all these studies about the housing shortage. And it's not really clear what the sort of objective housing shortage is, but there's a housing shortage for people who can afford mortgages. There's a housing shortage in certain places. There's a housing shortage for people who are currently living in family homes rather than single family homes. And so the mutual constitution of the idea of a housing shortage alongside the market that they wanted to produce was the thing that I was trying to understand. And so I do take the document seriously. I mean, I try throughout. I mean, it's clear if you read the book, or if you know me or whatever. Like, I mean, I'm a leftist, and I, my politics aren't like around, I don't believe that like privatization and debt burdens are going to be the foundation for a economy and a state in the way that I would envision it, let's say. But I do want to take these plans seriously because I think they're productive, and I think that it's what a lot of Palestinians are doing in Palestine, and it's what a lot of Palestinians are empowered to do in Palestine. And so I wanted to look at the practices around documents, around law, around development and things like that, and take them seriously. I mean, I don't think it would be really edifying to just sort of like criticize them out of hand or whatever, or like I have a section it's probably in the introduction where I talk about how I started to do research in Palestine, and I was really interested in sort of the state building project, and people say like, this is irrelevant, there's no state, it's bullshit, that's a quote. And so, and I don't think that's totally right. I mean, it's partially right, because it's Palestine, and I think that the way things move and the way things stay the same is really sort of a hard thing to capture there. But I mean, I do believe that this sort of documentation is productive. I mean, one of the things that was on my mind, and that I cite in one of those sections, is Matthew Hull, who's an anthropologist who writes about bureaucracy, and he talks about how documents move around and they accrue legitimacy and they sort of orient people's behavior around them. And he does it from sort of an STS perspective. But I mean, I think that like that kind of way into I don't know how you would say it, I guess like the human qualities of knowledge production and document production is one thing that I had in mind there.
Thanks. Let me actually take the bullshit comment. Because to me, it was one thing that really struck me almost from the first pages of the book, and I remember that quotation being in the book. But it's kind of what you do on a conceptual level. So part of this is disciplinary, right? I'm a political scientist, so I run into a concept like state, and there's 3 definitions of state or 4 definitions of state, and that tells me what a state is and what a state isn't. The concepts are doing serious work in your book, but they don't sort of mean fixed things. So you don't say the state building project is bullshit. you take seriously the people who say that. You see, something serious is going on here, but it's not necessarily what it appears to be. I think similar things come, certainly with Fayyadism. You don't say, hey, wait, this was just all mirage, but you don't, you're certainly take what I would say would be a critical approach, but you're saying this is changing things. Palestine is different as a result of this of this project. Even things like occupation, or what you just did earlier with resistance. Wait a second, what is resistance? If we put everything in terms of resistance, we're missing some things that are going on. So I guess. This is all, I guess, an observation, but let me couple it to a question. What you do with these key concepts, state building, occupation, resistance, seems to me to be interesting precisely because these concepts wind up being problematic, and again, I will use the term prisms to understand what's going on rather than kind of fixed concepts. Is that a good way to understand kind of how you're approaching these kind of these big meta questions that are sort of motivating the study?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is sort of what I was trying to do. I mean, we exchanged a couple of, breaking the fourth wall. We exchanged a couple of emails, and you said to me in one of the emails, there's like there's a lot of passive voice. Does this index ambivalence? Because you said something like that, and I said like, oh my God, was there a lot of passive voice? But I think that yeah. I mean, there's sort of two ways to answer it. The first is like as an academic, and the second one is personally and as a Palestinian. On the, the personal part is like, there are a lot of concepts and a lot of ways of talking about Palestine in academia and also among Palestinians, but that I think don't really, that maybe obscure more than they illuminate about what's happening in Palestine. And I think like make it hard to do certain things that I would like to do, like, have a sort of a anti-occupation movement building or something like that. And I think that that it was sort of difficult to take these concepts and to see like, what are they? What do they mean? What are they doing? And listening to people who are real estate developers or or talking about Fayyadism or whatever, I am critical of it, of course. And it's not just that they don't mean what the people think they mean. I mean, I'm interested in what the people think they mean and what they do and how they're practiced. I think that it's similar to the question about the studies. Like, I mean, it's worth it to say, to take, for example, developers at their word. Like, I think developers believe in what they're doing. Like, I think there is sort of cynicism and there is kind of like game playing and whatever among, people in Palestine just as people everywhere. But I think that, I think that there are people who really seriously believe in what they're doing. And I think that my goal was to try to understand like what happens around that, what happens around the practices, what happens around the things that they're doing, the things that they think they're doing, the things that I think that they're doing. That was sort of what I was trying to do. I mean, another little sort of tiny example from the book is I talk about going to the second Palestine Investors Conference. And this is kind of like a pun. It's not a big claim or anything, but like one of the speakers there, who was a Palestinian developer, was talking to the assembled crowd of other potential investors. And he said, make no mistake, there are returns to be made here. And he was talking about like, this is our national duty as people who have sort of like made it or become wealthy or become business people abroad, to come back, to bring capital into Palestine, and don't worry, like you'll do okay. Maybe not as well as you would do investing in another context, but like this isn't a loss, is sort of what he was saying. And and my sort of like pun in the book is, this is not the way the Palestinians are accustomed to talking about returns. But I think that's real. That's how, that's how he's sort of organizing his politics and his practice and his beliefs. And I didn't want to, it wasn't worth it to me to say like, that's not true, because I think that it is true. And especially when you're talking about, wealthy investors or people who are involved in the state project, I mean, they have a lot of capacity to make changes and to do things. And so that's sort of what I was trying to do with taking these things seriously. And yeah, I guess I got myself pretty far away from your original question. But I mean, I think that, yeah, the key concepts, resistance, occupation, yeah, I mean, in this regard, I am really, I think, being an anthropologist, which is to say, like, what are they? What do they mean in certain places and versus what they mean in other places? How are practices organized around them, and what do they do? I think was the goal, and I think that inflected how I talk to people, how I wrote it up, but also how I thought about the big concepts like state or capital or whatever.
Okay, thank you. I want to get back to the passive voice issue in a minute. And by the way, I doubt I said, does this index ambivalence? I probably said something like, is this kind of like ambivalence? But you made me sound much more sophisticated in my observation. I'll come back to that in a second, but I actually want to go back to this whole concept of state. So you're very explicit in the book when it comes to what Palestinian state building is. And again, it's yes, it makes sense to see it as bullshit, but on the other hand, real stuff is going on. We've talked about that. It's less explicit, but I thought I detected also with the Israeli state, right? So the Israeli state certainly can appear as a checkpoint or as a bulldozer or this sort of thing, but it appears here in a really odd form, and that's Regavim, this Israeli NGO, which you observe, well, wait a second, is this non-governmental? Is this actually part of the Israeli state? How is it attached? There's ambiguity there. So tell us a little bit about how the state of Israel appears, because again, it seems to be, the image I get is of something that is big, powerful, shapes reality, but when you try to grasp it, is not necessarily a clear, concrete, single entity, but more sort of this impersonal set of forces. So can you tell us a little bit about how Israel appears in the book, or be a little bit more explicit, like you are with your evaluation of Palestinian state building?
Well, I think that we're back to ambivalence. I mean, I struggled with that because I did have the starting point sort of as a matter of method, and also how I want to think about Palestine, which is I want to look at what Palestinians are doing in Palestine. And I found these people who are actually empowered to do stuff in ways that many Palestinians aren't. And what they're doing sort of in a Palestine or in a sort of state-like body, territorial unit, whatever, that I think is sort of suspended within Israel, and being the West Bank. And sort of I broadened that outwards to think about the ways that the West Bank is treated differently within the West Bank, but cities within the West Bank, but also the West Bank has been treated differently than other sort of Palestinian territories within and around Israel, let's say. And so the thing with Regavim really, so Regavim is a right-wing nationalist Israeli settler organization, the Israeli Organization for the Protection of National Lands. And so one of the primary things that they're doing is they are suing Palestinians and trying to stop kind of Palestinian building everywhere. And one of the things they do is they've kind of inverted a lot of the claims and sort of ways that Palestinians and Israeli left-wing or liberal NGOs are inverted the claims that they're making. So Regavim calls Palestinian building settlements, says that they are encroaching on Israeli and Jewish national territory, and so on. And so the first answer to the question, I think, is that, yeah, Regavim was, again, a good place to see, the different ways that the sort of privatization or even, I mean, to be very cynical about it, like democratization of Israeli state functions works, right? This is a private settler organization that's really empowered to do a lot, like other settler organizations, to try to block Palestinian building, to try to encroach on, negotiated Palestinian territories, and so on. I think the thing with Regavim really came to me, and I mean, again, I'll be completely honest, like I am not sure how clear this case was in the book. Somebody else asked me about this in a talk I did a couple of weeks ago. I think the question was really appropriate. The Regavim came to me because they were suing the Rawabi about building, and they were using this sort of language of the Rawabi as a settlement and so on. And at the time that I was doing the research, I was hanging out with my friend Nicola Perugini, and I told him, I said, I came across this really weird settler organization, Regavim, and at the time he was working on a project with decolonizing architecture about Regavim, and and we were stunned that we had both found this thing. We started talking. We started doing a little bit of research together. The research that he expanded on the research we did together, and it ended up in the work that he did with Neve Gordon. This is sort of my version of some of the research that we did together. We wrote a piece together, and I was really trying to understand like the law and what it has to do with this sort of like shared landscape of the West Bank. I mean, one of the things that runs throughout the book is that I'm like ambivalent. I'm ambivalent about characterizing what's going on in Palestine or in the West Bank as separation versus sort of like structured and different and fluid forms of integration. And so the kind of like competing legal claims that Regavim makes and that Palestinians make about the landscape, I think helped me try to understand somewhat the law, how it operates on the landscape, how it operates between Palestine and Israel, I think. So yeah, so the Israeli state, yeah, I mean that's a hard one because you do see you do see the police, you do see settlers, you do see Israeli prohibitions on things like water or building, especially as it occurs through negotiations. But this isn't a book about the occupation in that way, I don't think. And and maybe that's a good way of putting it. Maybe that turns out to be a weakness of the book. I don't know. I don't know yet. But yeah, it's a hard question for me to answer, and that's why I'm kind of floating a little bit in trying to answer it because I do think that that it's worth looking at sort of the Palestine that is being crafted within Israel. At the same time, it's hard to do that completely because Israel is the scaffolding, the framework for all of it. And I think that sort of accounts for the back and forth there.
Okay, thanks. Let me just one final line of questioning, and then we can see what other people would like to hear about. But that has to do with the context in which I use the term ambivalent and meant to comment about the passive voice. So there's a lot, I mean, you just refer to the Israelis kind of as a scaffolding. So this is kind of an impersonal force, and it's heavy and acts. And the passive voice, I was saying, it wasn't like I was thinking, hasn't Kareem read Strunk and White and learned not to use the passive voice so heavily? No, I actually meant there was something analytical going on here, right? There were people and forces, there were people who were being acted upon, okay? But then there's two groups I noticed here who really come off as just incredibly active, sometimes ingenious. They know how to work the system. They know how to manipulate rules. They know how to generate enthusiasm and spin and package and act. And the two groups are Palestinian developers and Regavim. When we had our email exchange, I hadn't got to the chapter on Regavim yet, so I didn't put them. But to me, there's like a difference in tone when you're talking about these, and the ambivalence is what I meant is you're certainly critical to developers, and I suspect extremely critical of what Regavim is about, and what the implications of their actions are. But there's this sort of sense, it's like these are people who are really there's real agency here. These are people who are shaping their environment. So I want to just ask you a little bit about this. Is there, the people that you see as individual actors who essentially, as I would say, have choices and make them strategically. Those are the really important ones. Am I wrong to see things that way?
No, and I'm telling a joke. I wasn't offended or weirded out when you said the thing about passive voice. I mean, I was just, that was a totally fine comment. I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, you're right. You're right. Those are the sort of two people, but also planners and also sort of some PA bureaucrats are the populations that I ended up spending time with. I mean, I guess it's a hard question to answer because I think you're right. And I think that one of the things that I struggled with was also like trying to find people who are sort of practicing politics at general scale or practicing sort of capital intervention or something like that. And there's it's hard to find people like that, I guess. And I think that the ambivalence that you correctly have found and have asked me about is like the relationship between phenomenon at much more general scales, capital intervention, state politics, stuff like that, and what it has to do with people's lives. So I mean, I think another thing that sort of points to that, but maybe in the kind of opposite direction of what you're asking is I talked to a bunch of potential buyers. This was before people were living in Rawabi, was when I was doing the bulk of the research. And I quoted a couple of the interviews at length. And one of them, I was talking to a guy who was really excited about the potential for living in Rawabi. And he was saying, moving into this place and taking on a debt burden, like a 30-year mortgage, gave him a sense of stability. And it really struck me because we were talking in probably 2009 or early 2010, just after the financial collapse that had been the result of all these sort of mortgages and questionable mortgages and stuff like that. And it struck me that he was viewing that as a vehicle for stability. And I think that, like, yeah, I mean, he exists in the same context in a sort of a different place in it. He also has agency and is able to make his own decisions and is able to take the things that are presented to him and sort of decide how he wants to practice them. I think the things that are presented to him and the capacity that he has to shape the landscape or have his politics sort of find expression beyond himself or his family or his neighborhood are just limited. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to explore there. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the thing with both the sort of the ethnography among the developers and the ethnography such as it is among Regavim, is that they are empowered to sort of make changes in different ways. So one of the things that Regavim does is they're cluttering up the courts with all these sort of frivolous lawsuits, but the goal isn't to sort of get favorable judgment on those lawsuits. The goal is to sort of have them aggregate and push the direction of state practice, or even less than that, to accrue legitimacy to their practices. So they clutter up the courts with all these questionable lawsuits about how Palestinians are building settlements and stuff like that. And every time they get an unfavorable judgment, they say, look, this is evidence that the state is against us. This is evidence that the state of Israel is insufficiently Jewish, insufficiently sort of protecting Jewish rights to historic Palestine. And so then they also accrue legitimacy to themselves and their claims in that way, and then are able to sort of present themselves as somehow in opposition to the state. But the goal isn't to sort of actually be in opposition or an opposition party. It's just to sort of push the court, which is one of the few places that's sort of understood within Israel as like genuinely liberal or or activist court or what have you, is to continue to push it to the right, such that it's sort of matching up with the legislative body. I think is the goal there.
Okay, to be fair to you and to be fair to your book, I want to flip this question around actually. So, I was focusing here on sort of individual agency, but there are some sort of big forces at work. And there's a lot that, I clued into right away, just as a political scientist, state and occupation, those are things that I know. There's one force there that I probably didn't pay enough attention to, but it's a major one in your book, and that's accumulation. So that's a term that I'm not used to seeing so much recently, but there's a political economy dimension to your argument that, again, I wasn't clued into as I was reading, but I began to notice, no, this is a major thing. And you made some reference to your own sort of political commitments early on in our conversation. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what the idea of accumulation is doing for you in this book, and then I promise I'll stop my questioning and let other people come in.
I don't want to answer the question directly about accumulation. I want to talk maybe a little bit differently about imperatives, which is sort of how I'm trying to understand the relationship between the big structural forces or general scale forces and what's happening there. So I'll start with the Regavim part. Like, one of the things that I think about is I tried to understand, Israel as having various kinds of imperatives because of the way that it sort of is and operates. Colonial imperatives or different kinds of imperatives, but it has territorial imperatives that I think are ways to understand what's happening there. So, you can ask a question about, why are these right wingers sort of empowered to do this stuff? And I think, the imperative is for them to control but not annex. The imperative is for them to, maintain civilian control without sort of a real outlay of resources or sort of military authority that might be politically or economically or whatever distasteful, and I think that or difficult or internationally difficult for them. I think that they're sort of thinking about the ways that behavior is structured through beliefs and imperatives, I think was one thing that was helpful for me. So one of the things that I talk about in terms of the developers is like, and the sort of the changes in the sort of orientation of the Palestinian state, is that it's organized around accumulation, around development, around privatization. And then I think once that's in place, then you can start to see the different kinds of like imperatives that are shaping behavior, say among real estate developers who are, who want to bring in funding, bring in mortgage financing, things like that to aid their project. I think that you can see it in the reformation and reformulation of how some aid is being funneled to the private sector in Palestine. This different kind of orientation. And I think that, political economy is my orientation. I was trained as an anthropologist and a geographer, and in that sort of political economic and Marxist tradition in geography, and I do try to see what's going on in Palestine with regards to capital and what capital has to do with state building. And I think that there are a couple of embedded arguments in the book there. Like, one of the things that I tried to push back against is this idea that sort of Palestine is unlike any other place. You can't understand Palestine. This sort of idea that runs through some of the kind of especially popular representations of Palestine, but also some academic literature. This idea that it's unlike anywhere else. And so I want to say, like, well, this is one way that it's linked to the entire world. The capitalism exists in Palestine. You read some books or some sort of pieces on Palestine, you might think that Fayyad invented capitalism. And I think that one of the things that I'm trying to say is that that's not the case, and it is actually one sort of vehicle to turn it around a little bit, one vehicle to understand how Palestine is linked to everywhere else, and one potential way to understand the state stuff and the solidification stuff and the class building stuff as sort of overlapping and intertwined with the specificities of the Palestinian case. So yeah, does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Yes, and it certainly jibes well kind of with what I read. Let me see, Shana, you're moderating questions from.
Yeah, I don't have any questions in the chat, and I don't see anyone with their hand up. If somebody does want to put their hand up or has a question, please type that into the chat. Otherwise, we can continue with the conversation as it's going.
While people are typing or reaching for the raise hand buttons, I will come in with a question, which might be a big one. So if hands start coming in, you can cut the answer short. I'm a little bit interested in hearing the reactions you got. I mean, you did this research over a period of quite some time. You talk in the book about how people in charge of Rabie reacted to you. Some openness, some closure, some suspicion, some people who were willing to deal with you. But more broadly than that, I mean, when I've worked on Palestine, which is, as I say, kind of off and on, one thing I've noticed, it's a small place, right? And I discovered more than any place else I worked. I'm not going to say Palestine is different from everywhere else, but one thing that was a little bit distinctive about it, people cared about what I was seeing, what I was saying, what I would say afterwards. The number of people who I do an interview with, and they already Googled me and say, okay, here's who he is, and here's what he's interested in, here's the kind of stuff he wrote, and comments that I got. And I can hear you getting into some sensitive issues. I can hear you provoking reactions. Wait a second. You're ignoring you're downplaying the importance of the occupation, or you're doing this, or this is the one positive development in Palestinian society, and you're mocking it or whatever. Tell us a little bit about the kind of conversations you had with Palestinians who were familiar with the work that you were doing, or even some of the work that you've published.
You mean conversations in general, or specifically during research?
I'm interested actually in when the results of your research became apparent, but you can take the question any direction that might be of interest. I
mean, the book is new, so I haven't gotten as many sort of responses as I would like. I mean, the responses tend to be good, but I'm not really sure, sort of in a big way, what people are thinking, or if they're going to read it at all, who knows. But I mean, I during research, I mean, and in terms of sensitive issues, I mean, it was to me, I think, a topic that, especially when I started doing the research, just was not very present in work on Palestine. I mean, there was some sort of work on sort of political economy in this mode that existed when I started doing the research. I mean, Adam Haniya, I think, is the first to really sort of bring this kind of political economic approach back to Palestine. Sohri Samour and Raja Khaldi have their piece in JPS. Tawfiq Haddad's work, but there wasn't like a big agglomeration of people kind of working in this mode. So I did get responses from people from sort of ordinary people or friends, like, this is like the bullshit person, like this is not the orientation you need to take. You're sort of ignoring these fundamental aspects of the struggle, which I took really seriously, and I was not very happy to receive those comments. I mean, I don't agree with them. And I think that as far as doing the research, yeah, like one of the people I talk about, not by name, of course, was a former employee of the development firm who really sort of opened up a lot of a lot of what was happening in the project to me sort of introduced me to a lot of current and former employees who talked to me, gave me a lot of documents and stuff like that. And I think that people have these kinds of critiques that are like adjacent and parallel to mine, like development is against the struggle or is against the nation or things like that. I mean, I think that the kinds of analyses that we do are in parallel. I mean, not parallel like in the mathematical sense that they never connect. I mean parallel like they're next to each other. They work together. They can sit together very comfortably. And then the response is like doing research among sort of private developers or bank people or finance people is tough because you hear the sort of the line repeatedly. You hear the kind of like the company line over and over again. And what I started to try to do and what I found was that if you talk to enough people, you start to see the center, you start to see how it piles up. But then everybody on the margins has I'm sure you experience this in your work a lot too. You start to see, this person tells it different than this person. You can tell what's important to them by the things on the side, on each person's own side. But yeah, the real estate development firm, I mean, the people I talked to, a lot of them were really great, were really helpful. They were skeptical of me because I don't think they wanted or were prepared for somebody to do a kind of like long-term engagement with them. The people that they were accustomed to seeing were doing these, really favorable journalistic pieces, or weren't really sort of looking into stuff about land tenure, complicated things, and so I did write about, some stuff that makes me look a little foolish, but my difficulties tracking down some of the people, including the head of the development firm, Bashar Musby, who I never interviewed, and I say that explicitly. I did a book talk in September with Mesna Kato and with David Harvey, and Harvey said that it reminded him of an Agatha Christie novel, which I thought was a really lovely compliment. But I yeah, I don't know how to say it, because on the one hand, I would like to get more responses, more reactions. It's pretty new. It came out in May, and then because of what was happening in May, I sort of canceled a big talk, or postponed rather, and was not very interested in having any conversations about Palestine flow through me or my work. So I didn't really do any. I was not active at all in sort of like promoting it until basically September, October. So I hope I get more. And I think that there is, yeah, I think that there is like a new movement towards either sort of explicitly political economic work or kind of geographically inflected work that that is in conversation with my work. I mean, I see the geographer Lisa Bungalia is on here. Lisa's work is wonderful about USAID and about development and about all the sort of complicated politics of U.S. war on terror and how it impacts development in Palestinian politics. I mean, I think that there's a lot of work that is trying to take Palestine and think about it more generally, that I believe I'm in conversation with.
Okay, thanks. Speaking of geography inflected, I think we've got a question, right, Shana?
Yeah, we do. This question comes from Mona Atia. She says, congrats, Kareem. She's looking forward to reading the book. Taking your perspective on how capitalist investment gets framed as a solution to the occupation and yet actually reinforces it, how did the international development complex, which is so active in Ramallah, participate in Rawabi or support that general capitalist ethos?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I talk a little bit about, but not maybe enough about, is how projects like Rawabi, I think, are setting precedent for different kinds of development intervention. So I talk about the PRDP, the Palestinian Reform and Development Fund, which was one of the which was one of the sort of important development world and PA reports and documents that kind of lay out a project and priorities for private development. And I think what I'm trying to do, again, this is related to sort of seeing Palestine through the prism of capitalism, is to try and say, like, this just makes sense. I mean, this for these actors, this is comprehensible, this is sensible, this is how, you know, contemporary politics, neoliberalism, whatever you want to put it, this is how it operates. And so, you know, through the PRDP, like Mandy Turner and Omar Shweki are people who are good on the PRDP. Adam Haniyeh, I'm sure Professor Brown knows a ton about the PRDP. I think that you know, a lot has been made of that document as a thing that brings different kinds of priorities for capitalist investment and privatization into the way that the state is working. I think more specifically how it's happening in, and Adam Haniyeh, did I say Adam already? Adam has written about the PRDP. And I think that how it works specifically in this case is, like, for example, the developers through the PA reached a memorandum of understanding that the PA, funded by USAID and others, would pay for all the offsite infrastructure, you know, things like that. You know, there are, through kind of the scale of Rawabi that I think will be relevant for the future, development world projects to back mortgages, stuff like that. And I think that that's how the development world is participating in this project. I mean, in these cases, really sort of specifically and materially, by funding the things that it needs to grow, to work.
Thanks very much. I actually have a maybe poorly formulated question, but in reference to your, Kareem, your earlier remarks about Palestine being sort of a case that is so different that it can't be, you know, beneficially compared to other cases. I mean, I guess the slowness or the lateness of, I guess, financialization and the development of financial and capital markets in Palestine, has that sort of changed? Is it just a lag? Is it a delay in the way that sort of predatory financial inclusion, if that's things like predatory mortgages or predatory sort of financial technologies like mobile financial technologies are integrated in Palestine? Is there less sort of exploitation because of that lag time in the development of sort of financial instruments in Palestine, not just mortgages, but other financial instruments as well?
I don't know. I don't know how to answer your question. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that to start, like, you know, to start trying to figure it out, or like the conversation that we would have about it, I think you would start to look at, you know, back to the specifics of the Palestinian case, where something like capitalist development can be sort of conceived of and like realistically practiced as nationalist. You know, the specific, you know, it's an interesting question, because I think that, like, on the face of it, yeah, it's super predatory to offer, you know, a 30-year mortgage to somebody who can barely afford it, who wants to move into a incredibly large, pretty empty development project that may not ever get finished, you know. But at the same time, I mean, there's something about, like, the promises being realistic to people. I guess this is also, I mean, this is the ambivalence and the difficulty in talking about this stuff, because, like, it's not up to me to say like, actually you're wrong. This is a mistake to take out this 30-year mortgage. I mean, I think that this person, these people believe it, and I think that it matters that they believe it, and that's what they're doing. So I don't really know. I mean, it also gets into complicated stuff about like land as a commodity, land markets, there is of course no open market in land in Palestine because of A, B, and C stuff, because of how expensive it is, because of A, B, and C stuff, and because of sort of Israeli prerogative elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. And it actually strikes me that in my sort of desire to sort of like take these things seriously on their face and see what they were doing, I didn't use any words like predatory or anything like that. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I think that if you want to sort of like part of sort of predatory or thinking about some stuff in the US context, like Yamada Taylor's book, like it's about like distributing or structuring forms of inclusion. And that's sort of what I think about also, is like if we take the sort of like the judgment part of predatory out of it, and then talk about sort of what's happening, the sort of like forms of inclusion, forms of including people, like forms of risk that inclusion brings with it, like in terms of mortgage financing or whatever. I think that can start to get us there. But yeah, I don't know.
Still a very satisfying answer. So thank you very much. I don't see other questions. Oh, we have one from Lisa Bungalia. She says, thanks, Kareem, for this important book. I'm really interested in your astute point that we can't take texts and the law literally, but we also can't ignore them. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to this a bit more, perhaps with some examples from your fieldwork. I'm selfishly interested in this as I'm doing work on how material support law travels in and through Palestine through aid.
I think probably the place where I saw that most in the field work, I think, was in the sort of reports and studies around the housing shortage. And Lisa, if you haven't, I can send you a PDF after this. But I mean, if you care. But I think that or I'll give you your own hard copy when I see you. But I think that you take seriously the texts, or I try to, and just the practices that emerge around them, So like these reports, one of the reports that I talked about, I kept on hearing about it when I was doing all the interviews with people in the PA and people in the sort of PATICO world of agencies. And they kept on talking about this one report, the Martin report, and saying, well, per the Martin report, this is what we're doing. This is the thing that sort of lays out from the World Bank the kinds of practices we're doing. And nobody had a copy of the report. And it took me months actually to find a copy of the report. And when I finally did, it was a pretty short white paper from a World Bank consultant that basically said, pretty unexpected and straightforward stuff about how, in the absence of a functional public sector, the private sector can do these things and so on. But the thing that was interesting to me about that is that everybody was invoking it, and everybody was sort of was orienting their practice and the sort of the activities and reports that came later on that basis. And so that's I think that's a good example of how a text, even one that many people hadn't seen probably, or certainly couldn't sort of produce easily, pushed all these activities and these projects of the government, of these firms, in concrete directions, and I think that that's probably, I mean, so again, breaking the fourth wall, Lisa and I have known each other since like 2006 or something, known each other for a long time, and spent a lot of time in Palestine, sort of in our research time together, overlapping, and we're old friends. And we both, we got funding when we were grad students around the same time, and we had to sign these documents that said we would not speak to anybody from Hamas, right? And that wasn't really, I mean, the sort of like politics and weirdness of signing declarations to the government aside, that wasn't really a problem for me, but I mean, I think presented a lot of problems for, I won't speak for Lisa, but for, I think for people who are doing work on governance, on local governance in Palestine, because they're just simply, members of Hamas who are in government in the West Bank, and so I think that that's a very clear example of how, the material support law impacts, behavior as among us as scholars, for sure, and so I think that, yeah, the way that these documents move, I guess it just struck me that it didn't get us anywhere, and didn't seem totally true to me to just say like, oh, it's development, which a lot of people do, like the developmentization, NGOization, and I'm not really sure oftentimes what that means when you read it. And I think that it struck me that just sort of the sort of like the quick critique wasn't getting us towards like what these things are actually doing. And I think that one of the things that, again, this is where I've just become a wishy-washy anthropologist, is that like one of the things that became clear to me also is like things have efficacy whether or not their consequences are intended. Things have efficacy in their absence. Things have efficacy in their sort of as they're critiqued and dismissed. Like I think that was important for me to do my best to capture. Sorry, my dog just got up and moved to another one of her areas.
We don't have any questions for her, but she probably has thoughts about all your work, but I don't see any other questions. Lisa, thanks you for answering that, Kareem. And unless we have anyone else, I think we'll probably wrap it up there. Nathan, do you want to have some final words?
Yeah, we have exhausted your time. You haven't exhausted our time because you've got lots of readers now that will want to invest some time in your book. Let me just close just with a couple observations about why people should read this book. Number one, as I said at the beginning, there's just an awful lot of research here. All sorts of things about Palestinian society, Palestinian life are, range from the difficult to the horrific. But you show you can do great work there over an extended period, and so that's good. And in this sense, I think I think Palestine is not exceptional. It's not a completely different place. But what I think you're exploring is kind of what is Palestine becoming? What are the processes that are actually shaping the way that people live, the environment, and the structures that govern their lives? And it's extremely rich book that way. I can't imagine somebody interested in Palestinian society, Palestinian property, development, certainly not interested. You learn things about Palestinian mortgages, that questions I never thought to ask before. So I can't imagine anybody going forward without using and building on your work. So you've done us all a favor. Thank you very much, and thanks for sharing your thoughts and your reflections on writing the book with us.
Well,
I wanted to say the link to buy a copy of your book is in the chat for everyone, as is the calendar for upcoming events for the Institute.
Well, I guess on that point, I hate to be a salesman about it, but there's 40% off with a Mesa coupon if you decide you do want to buy it. But I'm really grateful for everyone's time and reading, and thank you so much to everybody for organizing, Professor Brown for talking to me. Yeah, thank you so much.